Imagine lying on a filthy straw mattress, surrounded by women chanting prayers as your life slowly ebbs away. The year is 1347, and you're dying in the most common way a woman could die in medieval Europe: childbirth. Today, we're about to uncover one of history's most horrifying truths, the nightmare that was bringing new life into the medieval world. By the time we're done here, you'll understand why medieval women considered pregnancy a potential death sentence, and why the phrase "mother's curse" had a meaning far darker than we can imagine today. This isn't just history, this is the story of humanity's most brutal struggle for survival. Welcome back to Medieval Sins, where we unveil history's darkest secrets. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most terrifying realities of medieval life: childbirth. While modern mothers worry about epidurals and hospital stays, medieval women faced something far more sinister: a 1 in 3 chance of dying during or shortly after giving birth. This isn't just about medical statistics. This is about the raw, unfiltered horror of bringing life into a world that seemed designed to destroy it. From the moment a medieval woman discovered she was pregnant, she began preparing not just for motherhood, but for what could very well be her own death. In medieval Europe, pregnancy wasn't celebrated with baby showers or gender reveal parties. It was met with fear, resignation, and a grim acceptance of fate. The moment a woman realized she was with child, she began what was essentially a 9-month countdown to potential doom. Medieval women often wrote their wills the moment they discovered they were pregnant. This wasn't pessimism. It was pragmatism. Death in childbirth was so common that it shaped entire cultures. The phrase "in the hour of greatest need" wasn't just a religious expression. It was a direct reference to the moment when life hung in the balance during labor. Consider this. In 1485, Elizabeth of York, one of the most powerful and well-cared-for women in England, died from complications related to childbirth. If the Queen of England couldn't survive, what hope did a peasant woman have? The medieval world was structured around the assumption that women would die young, often in childbirth. This is why men were legally allowed to remarry immediately after their wives died, and why children were so often raised by stepmothers. The system was built to accommodate this horrific reality. But the physical danger was only one part of the nightmare. Medieval women also faced psychological torture. They were taught that if they died in childbirth, it was because they were sinful, that God was punishing them for their wickedness. Imagine carrying a child for 9 months, knowing that if you died, the church would claim it was your own fault. Medieval pregnancy was a test of survival from day one. Without any understanding of nutrition, hygiene, or basic medical care, pregnant women faced a gauntlet of dangers that would horrify modern mothers. First, there was the matter of nutrition, or lack thereof. Medieval women were expected to fast regularly for religious reasons, even during pregnancy. The church taught that excessive eating, even while pregnant, was gluttony, a mortal sin. Many women believed that eating too much during pregnancy would create a baby too large to deliver safely. This led to severe malnutrition, which weakened both mother and child. The medieval diet was also woefully inadequate. Most people survived on bread, ale, and whatever vegetables they could grow or forage. Meat was rare for anyone below the nobility, and fresh fruits were often unavailable for months at a time. Pregnant women suffered from scurvy, rickets, and anemia, conditions that made childbirth even more dangerous. But nutrition was just the beginning. Medieval women continued to perform back-breaking labor throughout their pregnancies. Peasant women worked in fields, carried heavy loads, and performed exhausting household tasks right up until the moment they went into labor. There was no concept of maternity leave or taking it easy during pregnancy. The lack of basic hygiene made everything worse. Medieval people bathed rarely, if at ever. They wore the same clothes for months, lived in close quarters with animals, and had no understanding of how disease spread. Pregnant women lived in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable today, surrounded by filth and disease. When it came time for labor, medieval women entered what can only be described as a chamber of horrors. The birthing room was typically a small, windowless space with no ventilation. It was kept hot and stuffy because medieval medical theory believed that cold air was dangerous to laboring women. The only people present were other women, midwives, female relatives, and neighbors. This might sound supportive, but many of these women had no medical training whatsoever. They relied on superstition, folklore, and remedies that were often more harmful than helpful. The actual process of giving birth was conducted in near total darkness. Candles were expensive and considered unnecessary, so most women labored by the light of a single flame or even in complete darkness. Imagine trying to help deliver a baby while barely able to see what you're doing. The lack of medical knowledge was staggering. Medieval midwives had no understanding of anatomy, sterile technique, or proper positioning. They relied on methods that would be considered torture today. If a baby was in the wrong position, midwives would try to force it out manually, often causing severe internal injuries to the mother. One of the most horrifying aspects was the complete lack of pain relief. Medieval women were expected to endure the agony of labor without any form of anesthesia. The church actually taught that pain in childbirth was punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, and that trying to relieve it was going against God's will. The process could last for days. If labor was prolonged, the woman would often die from exhaustion, dehydration, or infection. There was no concept of a cesarean section as a life-saving measure. If a baby couldn't be delivered naturally, both mother and child would die. Some of the remedies used by medieval midwives were actually poisonous. They would give laboring women concoctions made from herbs like ergot, which could cause severe complications or death. They believed that if a woman's labor was taking too long, she must be a witch or have committed some sin that was preventing the birth. When complications arose during medieval childbirth, the results were almost always fatal. Without any understanding of anatomy or proper medical technique, midwives were powerless to help when things went wrong. Breech births were essentially death sentences. Modern medicine can handle breech presentations with skilled technique or cesarean sections, but medieval midwives had no such options. They would try to pull the baby out by its feet, often causing severe damage to both mother and child. The baby would frequently die from the trauma, and the mother would often die from the internal injuries. Placenta previa, where the placenta covers the cervix, was another death sentence. The severe bleeding that results from this condition could only be stopped by surgical intervention, which didn't exist in medieval times. Women would simply bleed to death while their families watched helplessly. Perhaps most horrifying was the practice of embryotomy, cutting up the baby inside the womb to remove it piece by piece. This was done when the baby was stuck and couldn't be delivered naturally. The procedure was performed without any anesthesia, using crude instruments that were often contaminated. The mother would be awake and aware as her child was dismembered inside her body. Even when the baby was delivered successfully, the danger wasn't over. Postpartum hemorrhage was common and fatal. Without modern techniques to control bleeding, women would simply bleed to death in the hours following delivery. Infection was another killer. In a time before antiseptic technique, childbed fever was rampant. The symptoms were cruel and prolonged: fever, chills, abdominal pain, and a slow, agonizing death. Many women who survived the actual birth would die days or weeks later from infection. Medieval childbirth was dominated by superstition and religious belief, much of which made the process even more dangerous. The church taught that women's suffering in childbirth was divinely ordained, which discouraged any attempts to improve conditions or develop better medical techniques. Many of the practices around childbirth were based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. For example, it was believed that a woman's behavior during pregnancy could affect the birth. If she was frightened by an animal, the baby might be born with characteristics of that animal. If she was angry or upset, the baby might be born with a difficult temperament. Some of the most dangerous beliefs centered around the idea that difficult births were caused by sin or witchcraft. If a woman was having a prolonged labor, it was believed that she must have committed some sin that was preventing the birth. This led to cruel interrogations of laboring women, forced confessions, and even accusations of witchcraft. The use of religious relics during childbirth was common but completely ineffective. Women would clutch pieces of saints' bones or cloth that had supposedly touched holy figures. While this might have provided some psychological comfort, it did nothing to address the real medical dangers they faced. Holy water was sprinkled on everything, but the water itself was often contaminated and could introduce more bacteria into an already dangerous situation. The belief that spiritual intervention was more important than medical care prevented any real advancement in birthing techniques. The horrors of medieval childbirth extended beyond the mothers to the babies themselves. Even if a baby survived the traumatic birth process, their chances of survival were grimly low. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Anywhere from 30% to 50% of babies died before their first birthday. Many babies died during the birthing process itself. The brutal techniques used by medieval midwives often resulted in severe injuries or death. Babies were sometimes born with broken bones, internal injuries, or brain damage from the traumatic delivery. Even if a baby was born healthy, they immediately faced a hostile world. The concept of hygiene was non-existent, so newborns were often wrapped in dirty cloth and exposed to countless diseases. Many babies died from infections that would be easily treatable today. The lack of knowledge about infant care was staggering. Babies were often given inappropriate foods, kept in unsanitary conditions, and subjected to dangerous practices. One common practice was giving newborns honey or other foods that could cause severe illness or death. Perhaps most tragically, many babies who survived the birth process were simply abandoned or killed. In a world where survival was uncertain for everyone, families couldn't always afford to feed another mouth. Infanticide was more common than most people realize, and it was often seen as a merciful alternative to a slow death by starvation. The high mortality rate of medieval childbirth had profound social consequences that shaped entire societies. The expectation that women would die young in childbirth created a culture where men were prepared to remarry quickly and children were raised by stepmothers. Children grew up expecting to lose their mothers. This created a society where maternal bonds were often tentative and children were taught to be emotionally resilient from an early age. The concept of a stable, two-parent household was often more myth than reality. The high death rate also meant that women had to have many children to ensure that some would survive to adulthood. This created a cycle of constant pregnancy and childbirth that wore women down physically and mentally. Many women spent their entire adult lives either pregnant or recovering from childbirth. The economic impact was severe. When a woman died in childbirth, it often left a family in dire straits. Not only did they lose a wife and mother, but they also lost a crucial source of labor. Women performed essential tasks like food preparation, textile production, and child care that were difficult to replace. The psychological impact on survivors was also severe. Men who lost wives in childbirth often blamed themselves, while children who lost mothers developed a deep fear of childbirth that lasted their entire lives. This created a culture of fear and resignation around one of life's most natural processes. Perhaps most tragic of all was how little medieval people understood about childbirth and what they could have done to make it safer. Their medical knowledge was based on ancient texts, superstition, and theories that were often completely wrong. Medieval doctors believed that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They thought that illness, including complications in childbirth, resulted from an imbalance of these humors. This led to treatments that were often harmful, including bloodletting, purging, and the use of dangerous herbs. The lack of understanding about anatomy was staggering. Many midwives had never actually seen the inside of a human body and had no idea how birth actually worked. They relied on external signs and crude techniques. The reality of medieval childbirth was a nightmare beyond modern comprehension. It was a world where bringing new life into existence was tantamount to facing death itself. Women approached pregnancy with the same mindset that warriors approached battle, hoping for survival but prepared for death. This wasn't just a medical problem. It was a human tragedy that shaped entire civilizations. The knowledge that any pregnancy could be fatal created a culture of fear, resignation, and religious fatalism that lasted for centuries. As we close this dark chapter of human history, remember that the safety of modern childbirth is a recent miracle. The women who died in medieval birthing chambers weren't victims of fate. They were victims of ignorance, superstition, and a society that accepted their deaths as inevitable. Their legacy lives on in the medical advances we have today, and their sacrifice reminds us never to take the miracle of safe childbirth for granted. The next time you hear about a baby being born, remember the countless women who died trying to bring life into this world, and be grateful for how far we've come. The tragic death of Jane Seymour, a queen's final sacrifice. But before we close this dark chapter of history, let me tell you about one woman whose death in childbirth changed the course of English history forever. Her name was Jane Seymour, and she was the third wife of King Henry VIII. Even with all the wealth and power of the Tudor court behind her, she couldn't escape the medieval nightmare of childbirth. This is the story of how giving birth to England's future king became a queen's death sentence. Jane Seymour was born around 1509 into a respectable but not particularly wealthy family in Wiltshire. She was everything Henry VIII thought he wanted in a wife: quiet, obedient, and fertile. Unlike his previous wives, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, Jane was not known for her intelligence or political acumen. She was valued for her supposed ability to give Henry what he desperately needed: a male heir. In 1536, just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry married Jane in a private ceremony. The speed of this marriage reveals Henry's desperation. He had already divorced one wife for failing to produce a son, and executed another for the same reason. Jane Seymour was his third attempt at securing the Tudor dynasty. What Jane didn't know was that she was walking into a death trap that had been set by biology, medieval medicine, and the crushing pressure of royal expectations. When Jane became pregnant in early 1537, the entire kingdom rejoiced. This was the pregnancy that would determine England's future. Henry had waited nearly 30 years for a legitimate male heir, and now it seemed his prayers might finally be answered. But the pressure on Jane was immense. She carried not just a child, but the weight of a dynasty. If she failed to produce a healthy son, she would likely face the same fate as her predecessors. The ghost of Anne Boleyn, executed just months earlier, haunted every moment of Jane's pregnancy. The court astrologers predicted a son, and elaborate preparations were made. The royal nursery was prepared, wet nurses were selected, and the entire machinery of Tudor succession was put into motion. Jane Seymour was not just pregnant, she was carrying England's future. On October 9, 1537, Jane went into labor at Hampton Court Palace. What followed was a horror that would have been familiar to any medieval woman, but made more tragic by the stakes involved. Jane labored for 3 days and 3 nights. 3 days of agony with no relief, no pain medication, and no understanding of what was going wrong. The royal physicians, supposedly the best in England, were as helpless as any village midwife. They had no idea how to help her. The labor was so prolonged and difficult that rumors began to spread through the court. Some whispered that the baby was positioned wrong, others that Jane was too weak to push. The truth was simpler and more terrible. This was just how childbirth worked in the 16th century. Women suffered and often died, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Finally, at 2 a.m. on October 12, 1537, Jane gave birth to a son. The future Edward VI entered the world after one of the most difficult births in royal history. The entire kingdom celebrated. Henry VIII finally had his male heir. But the celebration was premature. Jane was severely weakened by the traumatic birth. She had lost a dangerous amount of blood, and her body was torn and damaged in ways that the royal physicians couldn't understand or treat. Despite her condition, Jane was forced to participate in the celebration. She signed letters announcing the birth, she received visitors, and she performed the royal duties expected of her. No one understood that she was dying. The medieval world didn't recognize the signs of what we now know as puerperal sepsis, a deadly infection that commonly followed difficult births. To them, Jane just seemed tired, which was understandable after such an ordeal. 3 days after the birth, Jane began to develop what the court physicians called childbed fever. Her temperature spiked, she became delirious, and she began to experience the agonizing symptoms of systemic infection. The physicians tried everything they knew. They bled her, they gave her purges, they administered various herbal remedies. Nothing worked. In fact, many of their treatments probably made her condition worse. Jane's condition deteriorated rapidly. She developed severe abdominal pain, high fever, and delirium. The infection was spreading through her body, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Henry VIII, who had been celebrating the birth of his son, now faced the possibility of losing yet another wife. But this time it wasn't to the executioner's axe. It was to the ancient enemy of childbirth itself. For 12 days, Jane Seymour lay dying in Hampton Court Palace. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body burning with fever, her life slowly ebbing away. The royal physicians could only watch helplessly as their queen succumbed to an infection they couldn't understand or treat. On October 24, 1537, Jane Seymour died. She was only 28 years old, and she had been queen for just over a year. The son she had died to produce would himself die at age 15, making her sacrifice ultimately meaningless. Henry VIII was reportedly devastated. Of all his wives, Jane was the one he claimed to love most, not because of her personality or intelligence, but because she had given him what he wanted most: a son. Her death robbed him of the one wife he considered successful. Jane Seymour's story is tragic not just because she died young, but because her death was so typical of the medieval experience. Even with all the wealth and power of the Tudor court, even with the best physicians in England attending her, she couldn't escape the brutal reality of childbirth in the 16th century. Her death reminds us that the horrors we've discussed today weren't just abstract statistics. They were real women who suffered and died, often after fulfilling their biological destiny. Jane Seymour gave Henry VIII his heir, but she paid for it with her life. She was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, where Henry would eventually be laid to rest beside his sweet Jane, the wife who had given him everything he wanted, and died in the process. Her story is a perfect example of how even queens weren't immune to the nightmare of medieval childbirth.